I'd just like to take a minute and tell you my story about when it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's quite a few years ago, and my son had just turned 10 at the time. And in terms of where I stood on the motherhood stakes, it wasn't very high. It had been a really tough year for him the year before. I had just remarried, married to Ron. I had told him on my wedding day, my last words to both my sons as I left to go on a honeymoon was that he would forever be my baby, that I wouldn't have any more children, and that whatever happened, they were going to be the most important people in my life. 10 months later, I presented them both with a beautiful daughter who's here today, Julia. The final part of the story was that I also promised them that we'd live wherever we were living at the time, but within a year we had also moved. We moved one street away so that both the boys could attend primary school and keep the connections up. But you can hear from what I'm saying, I was desperate to make them happy. I could sense that maybe things weren't going so well, and that was absolutely confirmed to me one day when I got a phone call from the school. Could I please rush up to the school? Because the teacher at the other end of the phone was barely able to contain herself. She wanted to see me straight away. When I got up there, she took me into the staff room and she was barely able to stop herself laughing. And she said, "Have you seen what Brendan wrote in his homework book last night?" And I said, "No." And she opened the homework book there, and on page 3, written in the scrawl of a 10-year-old was, "I found Mum and Ron having sex on the stairs last night." Now, I just want to tell you that even in my most physically able years, I have never been able to have sex on the stairs. So that showed to me that maybe he wasn't travelling as well as I thought he was. And I needed to fix a few things. Now, just absolutely coincidentally, the thing that was the most important thing in his life at the time was Cubs. He'd just joined Cubs. And he was terribly excited. He was at Cubs with all the other children from the street. All the kids, the boys in his class were at Cubs, and it was just the highlight of his week. Every Thursday, my ex-husband would roll around, knock on the door to pick the two boys up, to take them up to the local Cub hall. I always thought he looked slightly spooky wearing that Scouts uniform, but anyway, I shouldn't say that, but it was kind of funny because he's a great big bloke, knobbly knees. Anyway, so he would take the two boys off and they would just have the 2 best hours of their lives every Thursday up at the Cubs. The Akela, the den mother, was a lovely man called Scott, and he was the father of one of the children, and he made sure that those 2 hours were absolutely fantastic. And during that time, they had started to plan a big adventure. And the big adventure was that little Cub group, there's about 12 of them, they were going down on a bus down to Ballarat for the World Jamboree. It was the most exciting thing that my son could talk about. He would come home from Cubs and he would tell me about all the badges he was going to collect at the Jamboree. And, "Oh, Mum, if you only knew, and there's people coming from this country and that," and he was just so excited. And I'd say, "Yeah, I can't wait either." And then, one afternoon, about 2 days before they were due to leave, my son rushed home from school, came through the front door, banged the front door and went upstairs and was sobbing his heart out. I found out later from his older brother that the Akela, Scott, had suddenly got ill and he was going to have to go to hospital, and he wasn't able to take the Cubs away. And because it was such short notice, he couldn't find any other parents to do it. I was going to fix this situation. I was seriously going to address it. So I rang Scott and we talked for a while, and he said he thought there might be another Cub group that would take a spare Cub. So I rang this other Cub group. I spoke to their Akela and he said yes, they were leaving the next day and he would be happy to take Brendan along with them. But I needed to get to his shirts, his little dress shirts, and sew the new badges on, because each group goes down wearing their local badges, and his old badges needed to be taken off and the new badges needed to be put on. I don't even know how to thread a needle. But I said, yeah, that's fine, because I was going to fix this situation. And so that night, the Akela came over and he dropped all these badges off and he left. And I went looking and I found the 2 little dress shirts that needed to be fixed. So I sat there like Rumpelstiltskin, hunched over. First of all, unpicking every single one of those little badges and then re-sewing in my best Year 9 domestic science stitches. Even now when I think back on that, I kind of fall a little bit in love with myself all over again. It was a moment of great maternal love, I have to say, and given that it took me nearly all night to do it because I was so inept. But anyway, I did it. And the next morning he woke up, we packed his little bag and off we went to Hornsby to meet the new cubs, and off he was heading for this huge adventure. By the time we got to Hornsby and the coach was there waiting for all little Hornsby cubs to jump in, I knew intuitively that this was a terrible mistake. You could see all the kids were laughing and hugging each other, and they'd all known each other since primary school, just like Brendan had back with his little group. All the parents knew each other. They were all hugging each other and hugging the kids, and this was just a family, a group of people going down to Ballarat, and here was this little stranger going to tag along with them. But he was so brave, and he got on that bus and he looked at me, and the last thing I saw as that bus pulled away on its way to Ballarat was this little 10-year-old face plastered up against the back window with a single tear just rolling down his cheek. I had completely destroyed his life. 15 hours later, almost to the dot, he had arrived in Ballarat. He'd found the communications tent and he called me. He was sobbing. Mum, it's terrible. No one's speaking to me. No one even knows who I am. I shouldn't have come. I'm saying, Brendan, it'll all get better. I promise, Brendan, it'll get better. What's going to happen tonight is the opening ceremony. There's 15,000 of you are going to march, and you've got no idea how exciting this is going to be. And Brendan, when you get those shirts, I sewed them for you. Just put them on and think of me as you're walking into the stadium. I thought everything's going to be fine, but it wasn't. The next morning, the phone rang. It was him again. This time he was even more hysterical. He was sobbing down the phone, Mum, how could you? Why did you do that? Well, what it turned out had happened, because I knew nothing about sewing, is that when I'd sewed the little badges on the sleeves, I'd actually sewed the sleeves together. So here's this little 10-year-old kid trying to poke his arms through. And of course my immediate reaction was, we'll just tell them you're a thalidomide victim. And I thought, no, I didn't say that, but I had that thought. He was so upset. He was so angry with me. But you know that terrible thing when you're 10? But on the other hand, he felt so bad because everyone had been poking fun at his stupid mother who couldn't sew. So it was a mixture of outrage, love, just everything. It was just an absolute nightmare. So I said the only thing I could think of, and I said, just stay there. I'm going to leave Sydney in the morning and I'm coming down to get you. And I'm going to bring you home. And I was. I was going to leave everyone behind and get in the car and just drive down, pick him up from Ballarat and bring him back. I spent a terrible night, as you can imagine, thinking I'd completely destroyed this kid's life because I couldn't sew. And sure enough, the next morning, the phone rang again and I thought it'll be him. And I was originally going to get on the phone and say, I'm heading off in about half an hour. But it wasn't him. It was another adult. And it was one of the parents of the Hornsby Cubs. And he said, now, please don't worry. I'm just ringing to tell you Brendan's just been taken to hospital. He's broken his finger. Well, we think he's broken his finger. But the doctor will be calling you shortly to give you an update. I hang up. Can you imagine what I felt? What I felt, the angst, the guilt, the shame, everything, just all combined. So I was sitting there waiting for the phone to ring for the doctor, and it rang again, and I picked it up, and this time there was a happy little voice on the end, this peals of laughter, giggling. It was Brendan. He was so happy. He goes, Mum, guess what? I'm in hospital. And it's just like a MASH unit, just like on TV. He He said, it's an army unit. He said, there are army doctors here and army nurses. And he said, and they're just making so much fuss of me. And he said, Mum, I've got a broken little finger, but they've put bandages all over me. They've made me look like a mummy. And then he goes, and guess what? They brought this kid in this morning. He'd been run over by a steamroller. He was in seventh heaven. So I say to the doctor, he comes on, he's an army doctor. And I said, listen, do you want me to come down? He said, no, don't come down. He said, he's fine. He said, actually, to tell you the truth, he's such a delightful little man. He said, he's made us laugh the whole time. He said, we're bored shitless. We'll look after him for a couple of days. It was amazing. I said to him, Brendan, I'll come down. Guess what he said? Don't. Don't do anything, Mum. Just stay there. 2 days later, he arrived back at Hornsby, and I was there with all the other parents from the Hornsby Cub group. And as the bus pulled in, I could see what looked like a queen bee right in the middle of the bus with all these little worker bees hovering around. And as they began to climb off the bus, I realised that the queen bee was my son, Brendan. He had the best sling I have ever seen in my whole life. They must have got the army engineers in to design this. He had a splint. He looked like he just got back from Vietnam. And he got off the bus, and then I could see what all the fuss was about. Over that sling and over the rest of every bit of cloth on his body, in small medical sutures, were hundreds and hundreds of badges. The Australian Medical Army Corps was able to do for that 10-year-old boy what I had never been able to do. And of course, I have continued to meddle. I have continued to try to fix what doesn't need fixing. But the good thing about it is I have never, ever picked up another needle and thread. Thank you.